For nearly a century, Huguette Clark stayed hidden from the world. No interviews, no public appearances, just silence, and a fortune that would eventually spark one of the strangest inheritance battles in American history. The room went quiet when the lawyer stopped reading, not because the will was finished, but because he hesitated, just long enough for the silence to become uncomfortable, just long enough for people to look up. This wasn't supposed to be dramatic. The estate of Huguette Marcelle Clark, a woman most Americans had never heard speak, never seen interviewed, and in many cases never even seen photographed in her later life, was finally being addressed. She had died quietly in a New York hospital. No public funeral, no heirs stepping forward, no family gathered in grief. Only documents, only numbers, only questions that had waited decades to be asked. The lawyer looked down again, as if checking whether the words in front of him were still correct. They were, and that's what unsettled the room. Because for years, people believed this outcome had already been decided. They believed the houses were accounted for, the paintings claimed, the money understood. After all, Huguette Clark had not lived in any of her mansions for decades. She hadn't hosted guests, she hadn't attended society events, she hadn't even lived in her own homes. Yet those homes were still standing, perfectly maintained, fully staffed, locked, waiting. As the lawyer continued reading, it became clear that this inheritance was not unfolding the way many expected. Not for those who had managed her affairs, not for those who had spoken on her behalf, and not for those who quietly assumed that silence meant surrender. Because Huguette Clark had been silent for most of her life, but silence, it turned out, was not the same as absence. Outside the courtroom were properties worth tens of millions of dollars, untouched Fifth Avenue apartments, a Santa Barbara estate with ocean views, and a Connecticut mansion sealed off like time had stopped inside. Inside the courtroom were people who had been close to her in her final years, people who described themselves as protectors, caretakers, trusted advisors. And yet, as the will was read, something became impossible to ignore. The story they had told the public did not match the story Huguette Clark had written for herself. Because the woman at the center of this case was not confused, she was not powerless, and she was not unaware of what she owned. In fact, the documents showed something else entirely. That while the world believed she had vanished, she had been making decisions, careful ones, deliberate ones, decisions that would only come to light after her death. And as that realization settled over the room, one truth became clear. This was never just an inheritance story. It was an accounting of who stayed, who spoke for her, and who assumed they would be rewarded for it. And the most unsettling part wasn't what the will said. It was how long Huguette Clark had waited to say it. Why was her estate contested? Why did investigators later question the people closest to her? And how did a woman who lived almost entirely out of sight manage to control one of the largest private fortunes in American history until her final breath? To understand that, you have to go back before the hospitals, before the locked mansions, before the decades of silence, back to a family fortune so large it reshaped politics, industry, and power in the United States, and to a daughter who inherited more than money. She inherited isolation. For most of her life, Huguette Clark existed in plain sight, at least on paper. Her name appeared on property records, tax documents, investment accounts, and legal filings that traced back more than a century. The numbers attached to that name were staggering. Hundreds of millions of dollars, multiple estates, one of the largest private art collections in the country. Yet, as the years passed, something unusual happened. The records continued, but the woman did not. By the late 20th century, Huguette Clark had become one of the wealthiest people in America. and also one of the least visible. There were no interviews, no public appearances, no society photographs. For decades, even neighbors in the buildings she owned had never seen her enter or leave. And that absence became part of her story. Some assumed she had retreated out of fragility. Others believed she had simply chosen privacy. But very few people could say with certainty where she actually lived. What was known was this: Huguette Clark was born into extraordinary wealth. She was the daughter of William Andrews Clark, a copper magnate, U.S. Senator, and one of the richest men of the Gilded Age. His fortune placed the family among America's elite at a time when wealth shaped cities, industries, and political power. Huguette grew up surrounded by that world: private tutors, European travel, residences designed to impress. In photographs from the early 1900s, she appears composed, reserved, often standing slightly apart from others. Even then, she rarely looked toward the camera. As she grew older, that distance became more pronounced. After her father's death in 1925, Huguette inherited an enormous portion of his estate: properties in New York, a massive mansion in Santa Barbara known as Bello Sguardo, a Connecticut estate spanning dozens of acres. And yet, as the decades passed, these homes were left unused. Staff were hired, maintenance was paid, utilities ran, but the rooms remained empty. By the 1960s, Huguette Clark had all but vanished from public life. Friends from earlier years lost contact. Relatives grew distant. Even professionals who worked on her behalf, lawyers, accountants, financial managers, often communicated through intermediaries. She did not attend openings for the museums that displayed her art. She did not visit the homes she owned, and she did not explain why. What made her story difficult to understand was not the money. America had seen reclusive wealth before. What made it difficult was the contradiction, because while Huguette Clark withdrew physically, her financial world remained active. Accounts were monitored, bills were paid on time, instructions were followed carefully. Someone was paying attention. Someone was deciding. By the time she reached her later years, a strange pattern had emerged. Huguette Clark was not living in any of her mansions. She was not living with family. Instead, she was living in hospitals, not briefly, not for treatment alone, but for years at a time. Private rooms, paid in cash, no public visitors. And that choice raised a question that would follow her story to the very end. Because the money wasn't the strangest part. It was where she chose to live. To understand the silence that followed Huguette Clark for most of her life, you have to begin with the man who created the world she was born into, William Andrews Clark. In the late 19th century, his name carried weight. He was a copper tycoon at a time when copper meant power. Power to build railroads, wire cities, and shape the industrial future of the United States. His rise from modest beginnings to immense wealth made him one of the most formidable figures of the Gilded Age. By the turn of the century, William A. Clark was among the richest men in America. His fortune rivaled that of Rockefeller and Carnegie. He owned mines across the American West, banks, railroads, newspapers. He was also a U.S. Senator from Montana, a position clouded by accusations of bribery so severe they reached the Senate floor itself. Though he ultimately served, his reputation followed him. William Clark was known for ambition. He was also known for control. When Huguette was born in 1906, she entered a family shaped by loss and expectation. Her mother, Anna LaChapelle Clark, was already fragile in health. Huguette's older sister had died as an infant years earlier. By the time Huguette was a child, the family had narrowed. Her mother died when Huguette was just 16. and from that point forward, the center of her world became her father. William Clark spared no expense for his daughter. Private tutors replaced classrooms. Art lessons replaced social gatherings. She studied painting, music, and languages, always under supervision, always within carefully defined boundaries. He built homes meant to reflect legacy, not comfort. The most famous was a Fifth Avenue mansion in New York, designed to outshine every other residence on the street. Marble staircases, imported wood, rooms meant for display rather than living. Another rose above the Pacific in Santa Barbara, Belo Squadpo, a vast estate overlooking the ocean, built as a monument to permanence. These were gifts, but they came with rules. William Clark did not believe in uncertainty. He believed in structure. And in that structure, Huguette learned early how limited her choices were. She was encouraged to remain close, discouraged from forming attachments outside the family. Romantic relationships were quietly dismissed. Marriage was never seriously entertained. In public, William Clark presented himself as a devoted father. In private, his expectations shaped every part of Huguette's life. When he died in 1925, Huguette was 19 years old. She inherited an enormous fortune, but she also inherited isolation. There were no siblings left to share it with, no mother to soften the weight of it. Just money, property, and a lifetime of habits built around caution and restraint. From the outside, it looked like freedom. From the inside, it was something else entirely. Because while William Clark had given his daughter wealth beyond measure, he had never prepared her to live without his presence. And that absence would leave a mark, one that grew quieter with time, one that followed her into adulthood, and one that would eventually raise a question that no amount of money could answer. What happens to a life when everything is provided, except permission to choose it? Long before Huguette Clark withdrew from the public eye, her world had already grown quiet. The first loss came before she could remember it. Her older sister, Andrée, died in infancy, a name that remained in family records, a presence that never formed, a silence that arrived early. Then, years later, came the loss that changed everything. Huguette's mother, Anna LaChapelle Clark, died in 1921. Huguette was 16 years old. The death was not sudden, but it was final, and with it, the last emotional anchor in her life disappeared. Those who knew the family described Anna as gentle, protective, and deeply involved in her daughter's daily routine. After her death, the household changed. Rooms once filled with conversation became orderly and quiet. Schedules tightened. Visitors became rare. Huguette did not rebel, she retreated. Friends from her youth noticed the change almost immediately. Invitations declined, letters unanswered, social obligations avoided. She continued her education and her artistic studies, but always at a distance, always within controlled environments. Loss had taught her caution, and caution became habit. By the time her father died 4 years later, the world Huguette knew had narrowed to a careful routine of solitude and structure. Without her parents, she was surrounded by staff, advisors, and caretakers, but no equals. No one who challenged her isolation, no one who questioned it. In photographs from this period, she appears physically present but emotionally removed. Her posture is formal, her expression restrained. Often she is positioned slightly apart from others in the frame. She did not seek attention. She did not invite sympathy. She learned instead how to disappear quietly. Loss, silence, money, with no one to share it with. As the years passed, Huguette began to avoid situations she could not control. Public events, social gatherings, travel that required interaction. Her wealth allowed alternatives: private tutors instead of classrooms, private transport instead of stations, private rooms instead of shared spaces. And slowly, almost without notice, the outside world became optional. This withdrawal was not dramatic. There were no announcements, no final appearances, just fewer sightings, fewer conversations, fewer connections. What remained constant was her environment: enclosed, predictable, quiet. The same conditions that would later define her decision to live almost entirely indoors. The same conditions that would eventually make hospitals feel familiar. And the same conditions that led many, decades later, to misunderstand her choices. Because by the time questions were asked, the habits had already hardened. Lugette Clark did not vanish overnight. She receded, one room at a time. By the time Huguette Clark reached her late 60s, she had almost completely withdrawn from public life. But what happened next is where her story stops making sense to most people. Because Huguette Clark did not retreat to one of her mansions, she did not live quietly in a private residence with staff. She did not move abroad. Instead, she moved into a hospital. Not briefly, not during a medical emergency. She stayed. In 1988, Huguette Clark checked into Beth Israel Medical Center in New York City. She was 82 years old. She was not terminally ill. She was not incapacitated. Medical records later showed that she suffered from age-related conditions common to people in their 80s, but nothing that required permanent hospitalization. Yet she never left. Days turned into weeks, weeks turned into years, and years turned into decades. Huguette Clark would spend more than 20 years living in hospitals, moving between private rooms at Beth Israel and later New York Presbyterian Hospital. She paid in cash. She insisted on privacy. She refused visitors. Nurses were instructed to limit access. Doctors came and went. Administrators processed payments. And the world outside continued, largely unaware that one of its richest women was living quietly behind hospital doors. This was not a case of someone being held against her will. By all documented accounts, the decision was hers. She signed her own paperwork. She gave instructions directly. When asked why she stayed, she offered no public explanation. She did not grant interviews. She did not issue statements. Even her lawyers rarely saw her in person. Communication happened through notes, calls, and intermediaries. The choice puzzled hospital staff. It puzzled investigators years later, and it puzzled the public once the story finally emerged. Because hospitals are not designed for living. They're designed for treatment, for transition, for departure. Yet, for Huguette Clark, the hospital became a controlled environment, predictable, quiet, and closed off from intrusion. Meals arrived on schedule. Staff changed shifts. The outside world remained distant. And somewhere beyond those walls sat properties worth tens of millions of dollars, empty, maintained, untouched. Her Fifth Avenue apartment, once the largest private residence on the avenue, remained locked. Bellosguardo, the Santa Barbara estate overlooking the Pacific, remained sealed. A Connecticut mansion sat preserved as if waiting for someone who never came. And while Huguette lived in a hospital room, her fortune continued to grow. Investments were managed, taxes were paid, employees were retained. Someone was ensuring everything remained in order, which raised a question that would later dominate courtrooms and headlines. If she wasn't sick, why stay? Was it comfort, fear, habit, or something else entirely? Because a woman who could choose any home in the world chose a hospital bed, And that decision would later force investigators to look not just at where Huguette Clark lived, but at who was allowed to reach her there. While Huguette Clark lived quietly in a hospital room, her houses remained very much alive. Lights were turned on and off, gardens were trimmed, security systems were monitored, staff reported for work every day. One of those properties stood on Fifth Avenue in New York City, a sprawling apartment that once belonged to her father. At the time it was built, it was the largest private residence on the avenue. Entire floors designed for entertaining, dining, and display. No one lived there for decades. Another estate sat on the cliffs of Santa Barbara, Bello Sguardo, more than 20 acres overlooking the Pacific Ocean, a mansion filled with European art, period furniture, and personal belongings frozen in time. The ocean air moved through empty rooms. Staff maintained the grounds, but the owner never arrived. In New Canaan, Connecticut, another mansion stood preserved. Rooms closed, furniture covered, hallways silent. The property was heated in winter, maintained in summer. Unused. Altogether, the cost of maintaining these properties reached into the millions each year, and the bills were paid without delay. This was not neglect, it was precision. Every house had caretakers, housekeepers, groundskeepers, security. Some employees worked entire careers without ever meeting Huguette Clark face to face. They followed instructions passed down through managers and lawyers. Do not alter the rooms. Do not remove items. Do not assume anything is abandoned. Nothing was to be touched. Nothing was to be changed. Time inside these homes was controlled. The contradiction became harder to ignore. A woman who refused visitors, who avoided social contact, who chose a hospital over a residence, yet she kept multiple homes in perfect condition. Why? Why preserve spaces she did not use? Why maintain rooms she never entered? To some observers, the answer seemed irrational. To others, it looked deliberate. Because these houses were not simply real estate, they were records of a past life, of family history, of control. Each room reflected the world Huguette had been raised in, ordered, quiet, untouched by unpredictability. In a hospital, she could limit who entered. In her homes, she could limit what changed. Nothing moved without permission, nothing aged beyond repair, and no one could claim a space simply because it appeared unused. Years later, this detail would matter, because when questions arose about who had access to Huguette Clark, the houses told a story of boundaries. They were locked not because she had forgotten them. They were locked because she wanted them preserved exactly as they were. And that raised a more troubling question. If she was this careful with buildings, how careful was she with people? Because someone, somewhere, was speaking for her, handling her finances, managing her staff, deciding who could reach her hospital room. And as long as the houses stayed empty, no one could say they belonged to anyone else. As Huguette Clark's world grew smaller, the number of people around her narrowed. By the final decades of her life, access to her was limited to a handful of individuals. They were not family, they were professionals. At the center of this group was her attorney, Wallace Bach. Samuel Ingham had represented Huguette Clark for years. He managed legal matters, communicated on her behalf, and served as the primary gatekeeper between her and the outside world. When questions arose about her health, her wishes, or her finances, his voice carried authority. Alongside him was her accountant, Irving H. Kamsler. He oversaw the flow of money, investments, payments, property expenses. He made sure the bills for the empty mansions were paid, the hospital invoices settled, staff salaries delivered on time. And closest of all, physically, was her private nurse, Hadassah Perry. Perry spent years at Huguette's bedside. She handled daily care, delivered meals, monitored visitors. She spoke to her more than almost anyone else during the final years. This was the inner circle: a lawyer, an accountant, a nurse. Together, they managed the life of a woman who rarely left her room. To them, Huguette Clark was not absent. She was present. She gave instructions. She signed documents. She expressed preferences. At least that was the account they provided. But as investigators would later discover, proximity creates power. Because when someone chooses isolation, those allowed inside that isolation gain influence, whether intended or not. Some staff members described Huguette as sharp and aware, even in old age. Others described her as fragile, soft-spoken, and easily fatigued. Both descriptions could be true. What mattered was who controlled access. Visitors were screened. Calls were limited. Family members, already distant, were rarely present. When inquiries were made, responses came through intermediaries. The nurse relayed messages, the lawyer interpreted wishes, the accountant executed transactions. And over time, this arrangement became routine. So routine that few questioned it, until the state did. Because while Huguette Clark lived quietly in hospitals, money continued to move. Large gifts were made, checks were written, artwork changed hands, and those actions raised concerns, not because gifts are illegal, but because of who benefited and who did not. Some questioned whether Huguette understood the full scope of her decisions. Others argued she knew exactly what she was doing, that she trusted these people, that she chose them deliberately. The truth was difficult to separate from loyalty, and loyalty was difficult to separate from dependency. They said they were protecting her. Others said they were protecting the money. That tension would eventually draw the attention of New York State authorities. Because when a woman with no visitors, no public presence, and no independent witnesses controls hundreds of millions of dollars, the question is no longer just about inheritance. It becomes about consent, and whether isolation had been a shield or a barrier. Was she manipulated, or was she in control? That question would soon leave the hospital room and enter the courtroom. For years, Huguette Clark's life had unfolded quietly behind closed doors. That silence ended in 2010. It began not with a lawsuit, but with questions. Officials from the New York State Attorney General's office started reviewing records connected to Huguette Clark's finances and living conditions. What they found was not a single alarming transaction, but a pattern that demanded explanation. A woman worth hundreds of millions of dollars, living full-time in a hospital, cut off from family, surrounded by a small group of professionals who controlled access to her, managed her money, and spoke on her behalf. The state opened an investigation. The focus was narrow but serious: possible elder abuse and financial exploitation. Subpoenas were issued, documents were requested, hospital records, financial statements, and gift transactions were examined line by line. As word of the investigation spread, reporters followed. Headlines began to appear: reclusive heiress, hidden fortune, questions surround final years. For the first time in decades, Huguette Clark's name entered the public conversation, and with it came assumptions. Some painted her as a captive, others as a victim. Still others suggested she was simply eccentric. What the state needed to know was simpler and harder to prove. Was she making her own decisions, or were others deciding for her? At the center of the inquiry were the same figures who had long managed her life: attorney Wallace Bach, accountant Irving H. Kamsler, nurse Hadassah Perry. Investigators questioned the nature of the gifts Huguette had made in her final years, including valuable artwork and large sums of money. They examined whether these transfers were appropriate, consensual, and properly documented. The scrutiny was intense. So was the response. Her legal team insisted Huguette Clark was fully competent, that she was sharp, that she understood every document she signed, that she chose isolation, that she trusted the people around her. And then, something unexpected happened. For the first time in decades, Huguette spoke. Not to the press, not in public, but to the court. Through sworn statements and private testimony, Huguette Park affirmed that she was not being held against her will, that she had chosen to live in hospitals, that she was satisfied with her care, and that she trusted the people managing her affairs. Those words complicated everything, because they did not end the investigation, they deepened it. If she was competent, then her choices stood. If she was vulnerable, then every decision made around her required reevaluation. The case moved forward carefully. No arrests were made, no immediate charges filed, but the attention did not fade. By the time Huguette Clark died in 2011, the state was still watching, and the question that lingered was no longer only about her life. It was about what would happen after it ended, because death would do what decades of investigation could not. It would force the final accounting and place her wishes on record, in ink. When Huguette Clark died in May of 2011, the questions did not end. They sharpened, because death did what years of investigation could not. It removed interpretation. What remained were documents, the will, and the instructions she left behind. The estate was valued at approximately $300 million. Cash, real estate, artwork, securities, property that had been untouched for decades. Many expected the final distribution to confirm long-held assumptions, that those closest to her would benefit, that those who cared for her would be rewarded, that distant relatives would contest, that control would pass quietly to those already managing her affairs. That did not happen. The will made one thing clear immediately. Huguette Clark did not leave her fortune to her nurse. She did not leave it to her lawyer. She did not leave it to her accountant. And she did not divide it among extended family members who had not been part of her life. Instead, the bulk of her estate was directed elsewhere, to charitable organizations, to arts foundations, to institutions that reflected her private interests rather than her public absence. Her Santa Barbara estate, Bello Sguardo, was designated to become a public cultural center. Her art collection was placed under structured stewardship. Her money was allocated with specificity, amounts listed, recipients named, conditions outlined. There were no sweeping gestures, no emotional explanations, just instructions, careful, measured, final. This was not the will of someone confused. It was not impulsive. It did not reward proximity. It rewarded intention. The individuals who had managed her daily life were not enriched by her death. Some gifts made during her lifetime were examined, renegotiated, or returned as part of legal settlements. Oversight was imposed, transparency demanded. The state reached agreements to ensure her wishes were honored and her assets protected. And with that, the narrative shifted. Because the story many had assumed of a woman isolated and overtaken did not align with the record she left behind. She had maintained control until the end. She had known the value of what she owned, and she had decided deliberately where it would go. She wasn't weak, she was precise. The silence that defined her life had been mistaken for absence, but the will showed something else. It showed presence, and resolve. Once the will was made public, the noise began to fade, not because the story lost interest, but because the answers were finally documented. Those who had been accused of exploiting Huguette Clark did not walk away wealthy. There was no windfall, no quiet transfer of estates, no reward for proximity. The legal process moved slowly, deliberately, and in full view of the court. Some lifetime gifts were reversed, others were placed under oversight. Agreements were reached that limited personal gain and reinforced the terms Huguette herself had set. Her lawyer did not inherit her fortune. Her nurse did not claim her properties. Her accountant did not gain control of her estate. Instead, the outcome reflected something far less dramatic and far more definitive. Her wishes stood. The state did not rewrite her life, it enforced it. Bello Sguardo was preserved for public benefit. Her art was protected. Her money was distributed exactly as she had specified. The question of whether she had been manipulated never received a simple answer, but the record answered something more important. She had not been erased. She had not been overridden. She had not been replaced. Every major decision bore her signature. Every instruction matched long-established patterns. Isolation had been her choice, silence had been her boundary, and control, quiet, persistent control, had remained hers. No bloodline reward, no betrayal jackpot, only intention. The people who assumed silence meant weakness were wrong. The people who believed proximity meant entitlement were mistaken. And the woman who had spent decades unseen had the final say. Not loudly, not publicly, but permanently. Huguette Clark left no public explanations, no memoir, no interviews, no final statement to clarify her choices. What she left instead were decisions, carefully recorded, carefully preserved. A life lived almost entirely out of sight, yet governed by consistency. To some, her story feels tragic. To others, it feels intentional. She avoided crowds, avoided attention, avoided the world that her wealth could have bought her, and yet she never abandoned responsibility for what she owned. She paid her staff, maintained her homes, protected her art, and decided, on her own terms, what would remain after she was gone. Her silence invited interpretation, but the record invites restraint, because not every quiet life is a powerless one, and not every absence means surrender. Inheritance doesn't belong to those who wait for death. It belongs to those who respect a life. Huguette Clark lived that life privately. She ended it precisely, and the world was left to debate what that meant. Was Huguette protected or imprisoned? Who do you think really deserved her fortune? And if you had lived her life, with that money, that isolation, and that control, would you have done the same?